Thomas missed out on 8 days of peace. How much time have you missed out on in knowing the peace of Jesus because you're waiting for him to conform to your will, to your hard heart? Today's quick reminder comes to us from John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. And it reads like this: "But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples were saying to him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe.' After 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, or locked, and stood in their midst, and said, 'Peace be with you.' Then he said to Thomas, 'Reach here with your finger, and see my hands. And reach here your hand, and put it into my side, and do not be unbelieving, but believing.' Thomas answered and said to him, 'My Lord and my God.' Jesus said to him, 'Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see, and yet believe.'" This comes on the heels of Jesus showing himself to the other disciples 8 days earlier, and showing himself in peace in the midst of their fear. Thomas was not there. He has not known this reality that the others have come to know. Here, he presents himself as the victor over sin through the witness of the disciples, but Thomas is not ready to accept him as Jesus manifests himself. The verb saying in verse 25, the disciples were saying to him. The tense here indicates that they were continually active. So like the Amplified and the Holman both translate, it would be something like this. So the other disciples kept telling him, "We have seen the Lord." But he won't accept this. Jesus is using the other disciples to show himself to Thomas, but that's not what Thomas wants from Jesus. We see that Jesus' way of showing himself doesn't meet Thomas's expectation of how he wants Jesus to manifest himself. So in the second part of verse 25, we see that Thomas has a requirement for Jesus to meet in his life. He wants to see Jesus and touch him, touch his wounds, like the disciples did 8 days earlier. This passage reminds us that we're not in a place to believe in Jesus until we're ready to accept him as he reveals himself. In verse 26, Jesus again shows himself as peace. He showed himself as peace in verse 19 to the other disciples, and now he's going to do it again. He shows himself as peace. He comes into the room and he says, "Peace be with you." I find it interesting in verse 26 that Jesus came, the doors having been shut or having been locked. You see, they were shut and locked back in verse 19, and for a long time I've always wondered why. Why is it locked again after Jesus has shown himself to the disciples as peace? And I'm beginning to wonder if it was not because of Thomas. I wonder if Thomas is the one that locked the door. After all, it's Thomas who is singled out by the Lord specifically in this passage. And Jesus exhorts Thomas with his unbelief. He exhorts him with undeniable truth of who he is in verse 27. He shows him his wounds. He appears to him. But nowhere do we see in this passage that Thomas touched him. I say that because in verse 29 it says, Jesus says, "Because you have seen me, have you believed?" I think what we're seeing here is that Thomas finds that it was he who needed to conform to Jesus' requirement of him. Thomas's requirement was to touch. But Jesus, in showing himself, we find that Thomas realizes he does not need to touch. He does not need his way. I believe in verse 27, Jesus is dealing with Thomas's heart. Wiersbe says it like this: Jesus saw a dangerous process at work in Thomas's heart, and he wanted to put a stop to it. He sees his heart. And we know this is what the Lord is always doing. In 2 Chronicles 16, verse 9, it says, "For the eyes of the Lord move to and fro throughout the earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his." In Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 7, speaking of the children of Israel before God, are the story of God saving or rescuing them from slavery for the land of rest, it reads like this in chapter 3, verse 7, "Therefore, just as the Holy Spirit says today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as when they provoked me, as in the day of trial in the wilderness." Verse 10, "Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, they always go astray in their heart. And they did not know my ways, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest." They were saved from slavery, but will not know what they were saved for, because of their heart being hard. And then in Hebrews chapter 4, the next chapter, verse 1, it says, "Therefore let us fear, if, while a promise remains of entering his rest, any one of you may come short of it." For the same reason, a hard heart. So how does Thomas respond to this? How does he respond to Jesus and how he manifests himself? Well, in verse 28, he says this to Jesus. Having seen him, he says, "My Lord and my God." After seeing Jesus the way Jesus shows himself, not the way Thomas requires him to be shown, he responds with, "You are my Lord and my God." Thomas has come to the truth that his existence is all about Jesus and not about him. We too need to come to this, and in doing so realize that Jesus is simply allowing us to live in who it's all about. As Paul put it in Philippians 1:21, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Thomas reminds us that unbelief robs us of what the Lord has for us right now. Thomas missed out on 8 days of peace. How much time have you missed out on in knowing the peace of Jesus because you're waiting for him to conform to your will, to your hard heart? My name is Kelly Daugherty, and this has been a quick reminder of the His Hill podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can do so by email, and that address is Kelly, Kelly, at hishill.org. Thanks for listening. And remember, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus.